There's a little-known part of Hollywood that most people are not aware of, known as the Audience Test Preview. The book, Audienceology, reveals this for the first time. Our podcast series, Don't Kill the Messenger, brings this book to life, taking a peek behind the curtain. And now, join author and entertainment research expert, Kevin Goetz.
A book dedication is a deeply personal expression of gratitude, often acknowledging those who inspired or supported the writer. My first book, Audienceology, was dedicated to my guest today, and I'm truly, truly grateful for her profound impact on my career in entertainment research. Joining me today is Paura, an accomplished entrepreneur and C-suite executive who co-founded National Research Group, along with the late Joe Farrell in 1977. NRG, as it is more commonly known, set the standard for movie research. After selling the company 3 decades later, Catherine and Joe started Farrell-Paura Productions, and following Joe's passing, Catherine continued as chairman and CEO of her own company, Capstone Global Marketing and Research. She later held key positions at Alcon Entertainment and at my own company, Screen Engine ASI. Today, Catherine is a sought-after professional coach working with executives across the entertainment and business sectors. Catherine, I am so looking forward to reminiscing with you today. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for that brilliant introduction. And when I found out that you dedicated your book to me, I was very, very moved. I truly was very moved.
I remember you saying that to me. You said you cried, and I
did.
I love making you cry, so that was my intention.
That's nice.
An interview like the two of us are having is a blessing and a curse. The blessing is that other people get to get in on our sort of secrets, but the curse is that we know way too much about each other. So we will often take things for granted, or I, as an interviewer, have to not think that everyone else knows what I know, because we have been personal friends for, dare I say, almost 40 years. I remember seeing this really well-dressed woman sitting on the stairs of an exit alley of a theater, counting questionnaires and entering data, and I had no idea what anything was. I didn't know what a one-sheet was. I didn't know what a screening was. And you were so kind to me. And from that moment, we bonded.
We did. And sitting on stairs was so not uncommon to me, having grown up in Brooklyn. What's the difference between a stoop or stairs, right?
Okay, so another thing we share. We're both from Brooklyn. I'm from Bensonhurst. You're from Flatbush.
Yes.
Tell us about Catherine Paura growing up in Flatbush in the 50s and 60s.
Well, my grandparents lived across the street, and my Aunt Grace did for a while, too. We were a very typical Italian family, extended Italian family, and 3 girls, my sisters and I. We went to Catholic school. We went to St. Jerome's, and I went to high school at Bishop McDonald, and I started Brooklyn College in 68. But I was protege. I was like 10. So I don't want anybody to think I'm old or anything. But it was great. I mean, it was very different.
You know what's so crazy is that you come from strictly working class background, and yet education was so bloody important to the 3 girls, all getting higher degrees. Can you talk about why that was so important?
Yes, I can. My mother was a very, very bright woman and a bright girl, but she was impoverished. So when she was in 9th grade, the war was on, and she was yanked out of school, and she didn't want to leave school. And my father came to America in 1932 from Italy. He was 10, and he had not been in school. He grew up in southern Italy in a very agrarian society. When he came to America, Brooklyn, he went to school. He went to 1st grade, and he was 10. So it was an unhappy situation. He was bullied and all the typical things that kids do. But unlike my mother, he didn't like school. When World War II started, he went into the Army. He was 18 and just out of grade school. And my mother, her mantra to the 3 of us, Gracie, Angela, and I, had always been, I can hear it today. I can even see where I was sitting when she would say, get educated, better yourselves, get educated, better yourselves. If she said it once, she said it 5 million times.
I love that you recognized her innate intelligence and her innate brightness, and yet she didn't have the education to explore, expand that skill.
No opportunity at all.
Well, so you go to Brooklyn College, you leave, and you get a job in the city pretty much right out of school. Is that correct?
Yes, I got a job at Lewis Harris and Associates, the Harris Poll. Lou Harris was a very prominent political pollster at the time. In fact, he had been Kennedy's pollster, and that's where I met Joe Farrell.
And what did Joe do there at that time?
Joe, basically, after a while, he ran the Harris firm. But the first thing he did there, he started a little subsidiary called National Research Center of the Arts. And
was that like a passion project, or was that actually a money-making?
I think it was a passion project because, Joe went to, I think you know this, Joe went to Harvard Law School, passed the bar, and went to work for Milbank Tweed. He worked with the Rockefellers. So he combined what he knew from a legal point of view with being an arts lobbyist to engaging in research to secure more funding for arts. So by that, I mean, he was very influential in aiding in growing the funding for the National Endowment for the Arts.
Wow.
Yeah. And there were all kinds of art studies that we did for museums. And
that's where your love probably came from, the appreciation for. I like to tell people, Catherine, that you are a true and utter class act, but you didn't come from the manor born. You didn't come from that upbringing. And yet, as a student of life, you have managed to pick up and embrace some of the finer things. I'm talking about food and wine and travel. And you made yourself into a class act. I don't know how else to say it. And there's many people who are born with money and access and resources who don't have class and don't have that. And my husband, Neil, always said that Catherine's one of the classiest women that he's ever known. And I think that is so commendable to have achieved that.
I'm very flattered by that. One of the things I knew from the time that I was a little girl, and I think almost laughing at it now, when you think about the programming in the 50s and 60s, when I watched TV and I would see shows like Father Knows Best or My Three Sons or whatever, and they seemed very fancy to me. They had very fancy houses. We didn't have the fancy house.
Leave It to Beaver.
Leave It to Beaver.
The Nelsons.
Right. I aspired to that. I thought, I want a split level house with a pool in the backyard. But when I was a senior in high school, I went to work for a company called Donaldson, Lumpkin and Jenrette. And they were a maverick brokerage house. This was in 1967. And I worked there for 5 years or more, actually, all the time while I was in school. But it showed me how other people lived. And I was agog. I couldn't believe it. I had no sense of it. But I knew that I wanted a piece of it. And when I say we, my friends and I who worked there from Bishop McDonald, they only hired girls from Bishop McDonald to work there.
Good Catholic girls.
Good Catholic girls. And Bishop McDonald was a certain kind of school. It was a school for bright girls. And I was very lucky to be able to go there. I got a great education. And when I saw how they all lived, I felt that I had to learn this.
Wow.
And I observed, I listened, and I worked hard. And I came to be known by Bill Donaldson and Dick Jenrette. I mean, Dick Jenrette, and I didn't do it just because the time was so different. He wanted me to go to Harvard Business School and come back and work at DLJ. But I don't know. I don't think I felt comfortable going to Harvard Business School. it just didn't feel right for me.
And so funny, you were lucky enough to go to Harris and meet Joe, who really became a Svengali, a mentor.
Yes.
For you. And he had lived, and he had also from Staten Island, by the way, not from the manor born either.
No. His father was a New York City policeman.
Exactly. But yet got a tremendous education, highly bright, like you. Both of you, I imagine, IQs off the chart. And yet you were able to find somebody who took you under their wing and believed in you. Now we get to the fun part of Joe leaves Harris with Catherine Paura, his, I guess, assistant at the time.
Yes.
To go out, kind of Jerry Maguire a little bit, and go out to Hollywood to start a business called National Research Group. Tell us about that.
Well, what happened is we were still working for Lou Harris. Actually, DLJ owned Harris, and that's how I got to Harris. So I wanted to work at the Harris Poll because it was the Vietnam War and it was all kinds of craziness about working on Wall Street. It's just a different world.
Anti-establishment, not cool.
Yes, all of that. So I went and I worked at Harris. And when I saw Lou, he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I have a 2-week job with Joe Farrell in the arts department." And he looked at me because I knew him from DLJ. I used to do all of his personal accounting. And I was a kid. And he said to me, "Oh, dear, you can stay as long as you like." So
I love that.
anyway, so Joe and I went in 1977 to LA with Harris because Lou wanted to have an office in the Sun Belt. And then we looked around and there wasn't really much going on at the time, business-wise, except in the entertainment industry. And when Joe went to New York and proposed it to Lou, he said, "No, I don't want to work with those people. They're crazy." When Joe came back and said, "Do you want to start our own company?" And I wasn't so excited about living in LA. I was lonely. So I said, okay, I'd give it another year because I love the idea of being entrepreneurial. So we started NRG. The day of incorporation was December 15th, 1977. And our first day of operation was right after New Year in 1978.
Wow. Okay. What was the first movie you worked on?
The first movie we worked on was Lassie Come Home or something.
I know an early movie, though, was Apocalypse Now.
Yes.
And Francis Ford Coppola was a really early advocate for you and for NRG, correct?
He was. He was an early adopter of the process. Yes, very much so.
What was the process then?
The process was not so dissimilar from what it is now. The only big difference was in the very early days, we didn't do recruited audience screenings. The studios were doing sneak previews and we were handing out questionnaires as sneak previews. And in the case of Apocalypse Now, there were 3 round-the-clock screenings in Westwood. I think they were at the Bruin. And people just lined up and waited in line for hours, and we handed out questionnaires. And Francis was trying to determine what to do about the ending. So if memory serves, there were 3 different endings that were shown. So once one screening stopped, we let the other people in, and the last reel would go on. And so that went on for the whole night. And then I went back to the office where I started doing the hand counts and the coding. And, in those days we did everything. So
were you up on Hollywood Boulevard then?
Yes, we were 7046 Hollywood Boulevard.
Which was a former brothel, if I remember.
Well, there was a brothel across the hall from us. Yeah. In our first offices. And there was that sex shop downstairs.
Oh, well, I joined you in 1987.
But we were still in that.
So you were already in business 10 years. Oh, yes, you were in that
still in that crazy building.
I'll never forget, because you're on Hollywood Boulevard, so it's the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And when you walk out, do you remember whose star was right in front of NRG?
Oh, God, I don't.
Ann B. Davis from the Brady Bunch.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness. I don't remember.
And I remember saying, one day I'll be on here. I will have a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. In any event, you started with Francis, you started with screenings, and it wasn't until a couple of years later, or pretty near to that you started advertising testing as well.
No, we did advertising testing before we did recruited audience screenings.
Got it. So wait, but the Francis thing was after that,
No,
or
the
that
Francis
was not really?
thing, it wasn't recruited audience screenings.
Because it was sneak.
It
There were
was sneak
sneaks.
previews. And
So in other words, they advertised those.
That's correct.
People came to see them, 3 different audiences.
That's right.
But you did the data.
That's right.
You did the questionnaires, you did the analysis for Francis, and he was able to then say, wow, this is really effective. But you started doing...
We started doing ad testing first. Testing in those days, of course, you tested print ads, you tested trailers, and you tested TV commercials.
Who was your first client?
We worked for RCA Select Division, and we worked for the Rather Corporation. Those are the first 2 I remember. And then we also worked for Universal. Richard Del Belza was at Universal then with Willette Klausner.
And Perry Katz?
Perry Katz, I think Perry came a bit
Columbia?
later.
Wasn't he at
I think he
Columbia?
might have come a year or so later.
Got it.
I don't remember exactly.
But those were early advocates for you, because I know tracking started, what we know as tracking movies started a few years after that, but it was with sort of Richard and Perry and NRG initially,
Right. And Dana
right?
too. Dana as well.
And Dana
Yeah.
Lombardo
Yeah.
at Disney.
Yeah.
And then what you all sort of came together and created what would have been a prohibitively expensive product to create what is now a syndicated product.
But at first, what happened was studios wanted to do tracking. I don't even remember, to be honest, how the whole notion of tracking came up. But keep in mind that Joe and I worked at Harris, and Harris was a political pollster. And the similarities between political polling and polling for movies are apparent when you think about it from this point of view. If your candidate doesn't win on a Tuesday, you can't go back and rethink your campaign. If your movie doesn't open on a Friday, you can't go back and rethink your campaign. So everything leads to that opening weekend or that election. So there are a lot of similarities between the two. And maybe it came about because, tracking is such a big part of political polling even then. But I don't really remember. But
well, I can tell you what I think it is that when you came out to California, there was a seismic change that happened, which is from road shows to using television as a major form of advertising, and the wide release started really with Jaws and Star Wars only a couple of years earlier. So now you're thrust in a situation of having what is now known as the advertising flight, and no one was measuring the efficacy of a lot of money being spent on that television campaign.
no, it's true. When TV ads became so much a part of the campaign, the biggest part of the expense, certainly of the campaign, then the advertising testing became more important. And then tracking, as you point out, became important. But there were 3 different trackings going on. Several different studios were doing their own tracking. And somebody, it might have been Richard, it might have been Perry, said, why don't we all get together and do an industry-wide tracking?
Which is so much more economical and smart, because you also want to know what your competitors are doing.
That's
you just
right.
don't want to know what you're doing.
That's right.
What I found so interesting and what you enlightened me about was in tracking's intention has always been, as I said, to measure the efficacy, how strongly or not strongly you are resonating in terms of your awareness, your interest, and your choice. Is it your first choice to go see about 4 weeks or so before the movie opened? And there were very few people who understood kind of how to read it effectively. But then something crazy happened. And that was that at some point in time, and I want to say it was about 10 to 15 years later, tracking became almost a parlor game. It became a predictive tool, which it never was intended to do. It was never intended. Talk about that, please.
And people don't understand still, even more so to this day, but Peter Seeley was a marketing executive at Coke, and Coke bought Columbia. I think it was in the mid 80s or late 80s. And he insisted that we give predictions. And we really...
Because Coca-Cola sold units and widgets,
right. And we tried to explain that movies don't have a shelf life and all the things that could impact the opening of a movie, and even more so now. But no, he insisted. And then it just was like letting the horse out of the corral, and everybody wanted to know what their movies were going to do. And this was a horror story.
And what happened was you guys got a lot of pressure to get it right. And of course, it can't be right. It could be right sometimes, and it could be less right others. But directionally, it's almost always right.
That's correct. I would say directionally, it's 99% correct.
But when you start talking about the finite nature of it, that's where people have gotten into trouble. And of course, I read last week, someone in the trades said, because Screen Engine has a tracker, of course, NRG still has their tracker, MarketCast has a tracker. And I think what happened was people were saying, well, they missed by, I think it was $5 million on a $65 million opening or something. Essentially, we were all in the same range. And I was thinking to myself, boy, that's great.
I know. It's
And
true.
yet
Can
they
you
were
imagine?
saying, oh, tracking overestimated or
I
underestimated.
know.
And I was
I
like,
know.
you guys, you have no idea why tracking is there. So I'm glad we cleared that
Even the
up.
language. I mean, tracking overestimated, underestimated, tracking got it wrong. And, there were days when I just wanted to poke my eyes out.
And it's only gotten more so. Early on, you guys established yourselves as the go-to place, and suddenly research became an imperative. It became a must. You had to do research. What caused that? Well, when did you realize that it was sort of reached a critical mass?
This is briefly a history of it. When Joe and I started NRG, the studios were still in a distribution model. Put the movie out there and they will come. Well, that stopped happening. And therefore, the studios had to change to a marketing model. But not everyone thought of it in those terms, and not every studio was prepared to think about going from a distribution model, put it in the theaters and they will come, to a marketing model. There was PR, PR was marketing. That's what happened. But the baby boomers were such a huge population, not unlike when you combine the millennials and, the Gen Z, and now we've got the alpha generation coming up. But, when you think about the huge numbers of baby boomers, they needed to be marketed to.
And convinced and persuaded.
And convinced. It's persuasion and awareness. So it didn't happen overnight. Little by little by little, the studios began to realize they needed to advertise, they needed to market. And Richard Del Belzo and Sandy Reisenbach at Warner Brothers, right? Richard had already been at Universal. He came from Gray Advertising. And then Sandy Reisenbach and Joel Wayne came from Gray Advertising, and they all went to work. Perry Katz also worked at Gray. So they went to work at Warner Brothers with Bob Daly and Terry Semel, who were very much into the marketing. And that's when things really began to change.
They were really the first adopters as studios.
That's right.
Correct?
That's right. UA, Hi Smith was head of marketing at United Artists. And he was an early adopter because he was to market.
Who ended up running UIP.
Yeah, marketing for UIP. And it was Hi who hired us for Apocalypse Now.
Wow. By the way, UIP was a conglomerate for the international marketing of three studios, Universal, MGM, and Paramount.
Right.
An interesting model that I think now needs to come back because it is just too expensive to maintain these overheads. I think that there's a big white space and an opportunity to have another sort of model of a UIP. When we come back, we're going to talk to Catherine about the later years and what she's doing now. We'll be back in a moment. Listeners, the Motion Picture and Television Fund is a nonprofit charitable organization that supports working and retired members of the entertainment community. This wonderfully run organization offers assistance for living and aging with dignity and purpose in the areas of health and social services, including temporary financial assistance, case management, and residential living, and has been a crucial lifeline to thousands during and beyond the strikes. To learn more, visit mptf.com. Please join me in helping others in our industry during times of need. There are so many ways to offer support and get involved. Thank you. We're back with Catherine Paura. Catherine, you guys had a monopoly at NRG.
No, we didn't. We didn't.
I'm not allowed to say monopoly. I actually thought of Kari, our producer, and I were thinking about what's not a monopoly, but like a monopoly. But let's say what it really was. It was a majority. It was a very large percentage
market share
of the business. How did you maintain that? People were nipping at your heels constantly. And by the way, people should know that NRG, although they created the modern architecture for movie research, were not the first. George Gallup came to Hollywood in the 30s, along with David Ogilvy, and left a few years later, but never had this mass and critical success, obviously. Kind of left with his tail between his legs, in fact, because not everyone signed on to it. But as Catherine just expressed about having a marketing-centric approach and how the business had changed. They were reacting to the business. But you managed to keep at bay a lot of people who wanted a piece of the action. How did you do it? I mean, there was great sacrifice that came with that, wasn't there?
Yeah, it was great sacrifice. It was working 24/7 for 25 years. But that's neither here nor there because I really loved what I did. I mean, I really did. In fact, I do miss parts of it. I don't think it can exist the way it did just because times are so different, but I do miss parts of it. I really do. There are a couple of things I think, Kevin. One is it began to work when we started to test materials and movies started to open to higher grosses. There was, oh, this stuff really works. And then our interpretation and I think our approach to what we did as individuals, we were modest. We didn't take the credit. We kept our prices so low. It was so hard for anyone from real research to compete with us because we had volume and the prices were ridiculously low for what we provided. Now, a lot of people, if they hear this, they'll say, what is she getting? But they were.
No, I can attest to the fact that the screenings stayed at $9,995 for about 25 years.
And they started out at $4,800, and it took a long time to get up.
They were a loss leader because you knew that if you had them at the screenings, you could often then understand their movie, which made you more educated about how to inform the advertising for the movie, which was a more lucrative business in the advertising of that. Right. And then, of course, the tracking followed. So the three legs of the stool were check mark, check mark, check mark, a very smart philosophy. But you, listen, I remember the early days. You and I would sneak off to a museum here and there. I would go swimming at your house in the early years. And yet you already got up and you already had sent out faxes to the industry on exit polls. You had already probably were going to a screening that late afternoon. So it was about sneaking stuff in. But you gave really so much to this business.
I did because I was passionate about it. And also, if we were going to keep the kind of market share that we had to work nonstop because service was key. I mean, you know that.
Do I know that? You taught it to me. And I will tell this to our listeners. I have a insatiable need to put my clients first. And that was you guys. You never said no. And I basically never say no.
No.
I will do everything. And much to the chagrin of many of the people who work at Screen Engine are often like, can we manage those timelines better? And I want to remind people of what it used to be like and how competitive business is and how competitive our industry is. You have to deliver. Clearly, if there's something you can push back on, one will, one hopes, but often you can't because we work at such a rapid pace, don't we, Catherine?
We do. I mean, the timelines are almost inhumane. And certainly, I suspect they haven't changed very much.
You and I, we would do focus groups in a facility. You would take one room, I would do the other. The executives might go back and forth, and we would commiserate afterwards and do a debrief. During the focus groups, they were calling the editing rooms and changing the materials that were going to go on the air the next day or 2 days later. So it almost was superfluous to have a report written because the changes were already made. Mm-hmm. That's how rapid people have to understand and how urgent our industry was. So, for example, and correct me if I'm wrong here, and it's a bit of a loaded question because I know I'm not, the tracking would hit and young males were not resonating. They would immediately go and do focus groups to figure out how they could persuade young males. They would then cut new spots. They would be on the air within 2 days, and they would then see hopefully a lift because of the work that we did. But they didn't have time to think about it, to work on it, to finesse it. They had to make a release date.
They had to respond. And you could do that then. As you know, often we see in tracking absolutely no lift in definite interest. There used to be a lift in definite interest. And part of it is the trailer hangs out online for so long and the materials are online. But back in the day before the internet, you could impact definite interest by changing the TV commercials.
Exactly. And what's so interesting to me, and it still exists, is still in all unaided interest. That is, what do you know is opening this week?
Right.
Without telling the respondent, what do you know that's opening? That recall that is unaided. And first choice, that's my first choice movie I want to see. Those two things are the most correlative of all of the measures still today.
Still today.
And definite interest used to have much more of an impact than it does now. It's almost like, why even advertise on television for movies? What do you think of that?
Well, I think that there's some TV advertising that works where if you're looking at sports, for example, you can reach a very large audience.
Anything that's live, correct?
That's right. But if in fact today with all the tools that we can use for micro marketing, there's massive TV buys for movies seem not to make sense.
Especially movies that are not for everybody, correct?
That's right.
Because when you have a movie that's very specifically, say, psychographically driven, you don't necessarily need the reach and frequency that television in the past has offered, right? We call it in media reach and frequency, listeners, where you are spending a lot of money to get a large reach of people, and you're doing it often. And the theory was for many years that by hearing it and seeing it over and over again, and people did and were very tuned into commercials on television, you would then be persuaded, at least made aware, if nothing else. But now, many people don't even watch at all television. But it's still a challenge to get reach and frequency digitally.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a dilemma, isn't it? How do we reach people, Catherine, these days? What do we do?
Well, I think in these days, there certainly social media plays a big role in reaching people.
But how do you cut through the noise?
I think one of the ways you cut through the noise is by having influencers, by having a campaign. Let's say if you have an actor and if they have a large social profile, so you would ask that she or he speak to their fans and send messages that will resonate with the fan base.
Mm-hmm,
I mean, the fan base is certainly not enough typically to open a movie, but social media also, we can advertise online with very specific ads.
Targeting.
Absolutely targeting and micro-targeting. So for example, if in fact I were to do a database with email addresses and I segmented that database by taste and interest, so I would say, okay, this group would be great to send personal ads to, and this group we should ignore. They're never going to go see this movie. But this group might be a group that's on the fence, so let's target them, but with a softer approach. And it really is much more social. It's much more certain sites where you know that a certain group of moviegoers are hanging out. So that's what I see.
It's so funny. I often say a lot of companies hang their hat on fans and fanship. I think those are the easiest people to get if you can reach them. In other words, they're already essentially convinced and don't need a lot of convincing.
Right.
I think the moniker people should hang out is fence sitters. I'd like to be called the fence sitter company, not the fan company.
Yes, I agree.
Because the fence sitter company is what every marketer seeks. How do I get those people that are thinking about it, are close, but need persuasion? Not the ones, to your point, Catherine, that will never be persuaded, because you also have to identify them, because that's a lot of wasted resource, a lot of wasted money and expense. You're trying to convince people that will never be converted, and that's not a smart thing either. So you want to be able to say, okay, if I put the right resources and money into the awareness of my fans, I don't really have to do very much. They'll come. Where the opportunity exists is those people who are even definites but not absolutely certain, or high level of probability in the probables. Those are the people, to me, where marketing comes into mostly today, is identifying them, reaching them, and convincing them.
And you bring up a very important point, because one of the things we can easily forget is that messaging is still key.
Oh, amen.
Messaging, messaging, messaging. And I think that sometimes we lose sight of that. And it's not about throwing something against the wall and it will stick. It's about really being very specific in a message that will work to persuade.
Boy, that is absolutely music to my ears. I cannot tell you, and you'll agree with me on this, I'm certain. There are so many people who are really, really smart marketers, smart researchers, smart strategists who have been forgotten and who have such a great sense of messaging.
Mm-hmm.
And you can hire someone to implement a digital campaign, but you can't hire somebody who doesn't know how to do messaging.
That's correct.
That's a talent and a skill that has to be marinated and honed and really embraced. Once you have that, it's a matter of getting it out there. And there's a lot of younger folks and people who are entering the business who have a really great skill at that. But to get to the place of understanding what a campaign means, what messaging really means, how to persuade people, to me, a lot of the people who are being forgotten should be reconsidered.
I completely agree. And messaging needs to be tested, because we don't know. I can't tell you what a male of 25 or 30 would want to see.
And a marketer who is 35 can't tell what a person in their 60s, a female or male, wants to see, really.
That's correct.
And by the way, let's even go a step further and say it's probably not anymore even so delineated by age and gender as it is sensibilities.
I think that's correct.
Because, like you and I essentially of a similar age,
Thank you.
I know, but we come from the same generation of boomers. I'm the last year of the boomers. I'll just say that. And the fact is, though, we relate and understand and share so many commonalities. But as a man and a woman, we may not be marketed to the same way because of the way demographics have been used. And that's a shame. And then if you add race or ethnicity into that, we may not see something. I mean, you wrote your dissertation on Black cinema,
Yes.
on Black movies' effects on the general culture of movies. And I found that fascinating. So I know you have an innate interest in so many African-American and Black stories, yet you wouldn't even know about most of them if people are marketing towards demographics alone and not sensibilities.
That's right. And that's becoming increasingly important as the audiences become more segmented. And when we think about movies today, we have to think about where we're going to watch them and how are we going to get people to go to the theater, because we want people to go to the movie theaters to watch films. But if they're not going to the movie theater, how do we get them at least to watch them on the streaming services?
I contend that the level of quality has taken even a more important seat today, because nobody wants to watch a mediocre or even a, dare I say, very good movie. It has to be great on any platform, whether it's a movie theater or on a service. It has to have a certain level of quality and word of mouth, period. Full stop.
I completely agree. Of course.
So what's happening? What's going to happen to our industry, say, in the next 5 years? Do you have any sort of prognostications, some vision that you can offer?
Yeah. I mean, I do always have theories. You know me, I always have my theories.
I do.
One of the things that I think will most likely occur is I think there will continue to be a shrinking of the theatrical audience. It's not going to be a disappearance, but I think it will be a shrinking of the theatrical audience. And I think there are many, many complicated reasons for that. But one of the reasons is, I think as the boomers get older, and they're almost the last generation that are completely habituated to going to the movies because we didn't have many other choices. We went to the movies or we read a book because our parents had one little TV and they controlled it. Now, when I think about the opportunity that people have to watch entertainment, if you can save a lot of money and stay home and not pay a babysitter and not pay for parking and not go out to eat. As a friend of mine said, her millennial daughter, she stays home, she rolls up into her PJs on a Friday night with her husband. They call DoorDash or whatever, Uber Eats, and they have a great meal sitting at home in front of their 100-inch TV or whatever the largest TV is that you can get. And I think the bottom line, because I could go on and on and on, is habits have changed. And I think COVID ushered in even more rapidly the change in habits.
It didn't cause it, I like to say, but it accelerated it.
Accelerated it. It absolutely accelerated it because we were going there.
There's no question. And I had conducted a very big study in 2019, which we presented in January of 20, that was very prescient, very much a predictor of what was going to happen by 2030, let's say. I was about to say within the next 10 years, which essentially is happening now, 5 years later. And I believe that because of the pandemic and the effects of that, it accelerated and exacerbated what was already there.
That's exactly correct.
I have a question for you. I was going to ask you, Catherine, if you could say there was one mistake, and I ask many of my guests this question, one mistake you made in it could be your life or your career, that you, first of all, what was the biggest mistake you made? And then I'm going to ask you, what did you learn from it?
I think one of the things that I would consider a big mistake is in the early days of NRG, I didn't take any time for myself and I just wore myself out. And it's very bad. And I had a friend, some of your listeners might remember her. I don't know if people have short memories, but her name was Marty Moran's.
Paramount.
And she died in 1990 of brain cancer at 41 years old. And I went out to lunch with her in July. She died in August. And we went out to eat. I picked her up. She was in terrible shape and she was apologizing because she couldn't hold her floor. I said, please, Marty, it's so unnecessary. Just let's have a little chat or whatever I said. I mean, I was devastated, of course. And she said to me, and I have chills telling you this, she said, Catherine, when you're dying, you will never wish that you had worked one more day. And I have never gotten a greater gift than that. And I started to take vacations. It was...
Wow.
I was 40 years old and I started to take vacations. Now, I didn't take very long vacations back in the day and I was constantly on the phone, but I did start to take some time for myself. And that serves me well to this day when I think about what Marty said. You will never wish that you had worked one more day when you're dying.
Beautiful, incredible advice. You and your sister, Angela, lost your sister. I loved Gracie.
She was your favorite. That's okay.
You're all my favorites. Gracie and I had a certain kind of, what do you call it? Je ne sais quoi.
The two of you were great friends and you had so much fun together.
Oh, we always danced together at
I know.
bar mitzvahs and weddings and all sorts of things.
It was the best.
And I remember flying in for her funeral because she meant so much to me. She was so special, and it only brought you and Angela, who is your marvelous younger sister, together even closer. You've been great partners in business and in life. What's that secret about?
I think one of the things I joke and I say it's my good nature. And Angela says it's because
and Angela says, no, it's my good nature.
No, she says she knows who's the boss.
Wait, what does Angela say?
That she knows who the boss is.
Oh, very good. Smart lady.
Yes. But I think really what it is, particularly at this point, and, after having lost Gracie, which, we don't get over, we still haven't gotten over. And
you never will.
Never will. No. And when you walked into that funeral home, I mean, I was just so moved. I was weeping. So
it's important to show up, isn't it? I mean,
yes, it is.
It's important to show up. And my dad, who passed away this year, also showed up, if you remember, with me because He also, our families have spent so many times together over the years, Christmases, New Year's,
Oh, so
pool
much fun.
parties. And let this be a lesson to everyone, because it piggybacks kind of what you were saying about us. And we go back 40 years. We worked together in different capacities. You were my boss. I was your boss, which was a great and scary prospect.
You're so funny.
I did that with Bob Levin, too. When I first saw him, I was sitting behind my desk and I said, Bob, I can't sit behind my desk. I have to let you sit behind my desk. And I swear to God, it's true. It is an absolutely true story. We revered him, right? He was one of our biggest clients.
No, I know. Listen, I know.
But there's something to be said about this podcast, for example, where we focus almost less on the business and more on us and our personal, because that's really the connection and what matters in life, I think. And I know you do too.
Of course I do. You know I do.
Catherine, before we break, I would be remiss if we didn't talk about your coaching career, which is sort of your third act, if you will, career-wise. And you are so good at what you do. I know I've sent you a number of clients and you've had great success with them, executive coaching and imparting all the wisdom that you've acquired and are able to then give back. How did that come to be? How did you, or when did you say, I think I want to be an executive life coach, an inspiration to others?
Thank you for asking about what I'm doing now. I mean, I really couldn't bear the thought of retirement. I still can't bear the thought of quote unquote.
Oh, you're never retiring.
No, I'll never retire. I mean, it's
Nor
just,
will I. I don't even know what that word means.
No, it's an ugly word. It really is an ugly word, I think. But I thought, what am I going to do when I leave LA, when I leave the business? And one of the things I thought, there were actually two things I thought I would do. One is that I would become a professional coach. And, coaching, I hate the word
Sorry,
coaching.
before you go into it, what was the other thing?
Yeah. Oh, to become a teacher of English as a second language.
Oh, I thought you were going to say run for public office, which you also...
Oh, I did that too. Oh, I forgot.
Exactly.
I did that
in New Jersey. Ay, ay, ay. Okay,
Ay, ay, ay.
Okay.
Yes, I ran as a Democrat for Ocean County Commissioner
Which is
twice.
the most red county in all of New Jersey, by the way.
Yes,
God bless you.
I nearly lost my life doing it, but people were awful to me. So I did teach English as a second language, and the school district here I've gotten to know some of the people, and they want me to come and do it again.
You also did work in the prison system, I want to say.
Yes, and I worked, which
was very impressive.
Oh my God, I worked at a maximum security prison in New York State called Bedford Hills.
With women, men, both?
Women.
I'm going to go on a limb and say that had a profound effect on why you decided to be a life coach.
Yes.
It had to. How could it not?
Of course it does. And I decided to become a coach because over the years, so many people have said I've been so helpful to them. And so I took a very serious course. It was 4 modules and it was over a year. And I got my International Coaching Federation certificate, which is the gold standard for coaching around the world, ICF. Then, of course, I took continuing education units. I took at Harvard Extension, I took a leadership course, mastery in leadership coaching. I took psychology for coaches, and I've just finished neuroscience and coaching. And they have all really added to my coaching practice and made me a better coach. I've worked with all kinds of people. I've worked with college students going into the workforce.
Oh, that's interesting.
People recovering from addiction.
Ooh.
I've worked with C-suite executives. I've worked with middle managers who want to either do better or transform in some way or find a new job. So it's great.
How do people get in touch with you do you have a business name that you are going?
Sistina Coaching, LLC.
Sistina, like the Sistine Chapel?
Yes. And the reason why I did that, because I wanted to harken back to my Italian heritage. And Sistina to me is, it's art. And aren't we all art? We all create our own lives. We all paint our own pictures, so to speak. We are all creative in our own way. It doesn't have to be Leonardo da Vinci's, but we are all creative. We create our own lives. So I thought Sistina was a way of communicating that.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. Catherine, you are a treasure and beyond important in my life. I mean, when my mom passed away, you were I think the first call I made.
Oh, Kevin, I'll never forget that. I can see myself
Yeah.
answering that.
And when your mother died, I remember Joe writing the memo to everyone. And it was so devastating because, we were starting to lose people close to us in that way. So I just want to say thank you for teaching me so much. Thank you for enlightening and bringing so much to the industry that you love, because you made a tremendous impact on the movie business and on my particular area, which is research and strategy.
Well, I want to say that I am so very proud of you. And I think it's wonderful what you've been able to achieve. And I think that it's so glorious. It's so fantastic. And as someone whom I think of sometimes as my little brother, or this kid I hung out with on the steps, no kid, and a smart man, you did a whole lot with your life. And as I say, I'm really proud of you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. To our listeners, I hope you enjoyed our interview today. For other stories like this one, please check out my book, Audienceology, at Amazon or through my website at kevingetz360.com. You can also always follow me on my social media. Next time on Don't Kill the Messenger, I'll welcome director, writer, and producer Brad Furman. Until then, I'm Kevin Goetz, and to you, our listeners, I appreciate you being part of the movie-making process. Your opinions matter.